Hello everyone, I think we're going to start. Take a seat. Hi, welcome. Welcome everybody. Well, I'm really happy to have you all tonight for our third conference on the MENA region. We have the pleasure to have with us tonight Matthieu Rey, who is French. Rey, by his name, right? You can guess. Okay. So, Matthieu is a researcher at the Collège de France in Paris. He's a friend, first, so it's a very good sign of quality. And he's an excellent researcher, of course. So he's an historian, contemporary history, mostly. He is working on Syria and Iraq. And he's been actually doing a lot of field work in both countries. And Matthieu, and he will explain us that, was actually in Syria when the conflict started, or the spring, if you want to call it like that. So, well, without any further ado, we welcome Matthieu.
This is my turn.
So, yeah, your turn. So, Matthieu, can you maybe just first tell us a little bit who you are and, what kind of experience you had maybe on the field in Syria? And then we can, try to go a bit deeper in the topic.
So first, started a Ph.D. in 2009, deciding to work on Syria, which was at this time a peaceful country, which in this region is a bit particular. I often go back in the region. I was on the Syrian border about 6 days ago or something like this to make some interviews with some refugees and some friends who are inside the country. I haven't decided to focus on the current situation. It's more because I was inside the country that I can follow and analyze and understand what was going on. So I spent about 4 years in Syria between 2009 and 2013. So what I would like to try tonight is just to draw a general trajectory, the rocky parts of the Syrian revolution, not uprising or what else, and then to see how it turned to be a conflict and how it turned to be connected between internal actors and external actors, which is quite well known in history as the question of Orient. So I decided to call it the black hole, the Syrian black hole, because if you are considering Syria, it's like this physical phenomenon. You don't see any light coming from Syria. You never speak about the Syrian, you always speak about geopolitical consideration about Syria. What Russians are doing, what the Americans decide to do, what ISIS are doing, and so on. But you never focus on what's going on the ground, how people are living, what they are doing to do, why they have been committed toward revolutions, why they decided to appeal against a regime, and what was this regime at the end, how it changed on the ground. And the second phenomenon connected to the black hole is that any power or any elements who are connected toward it is always pushed slowly deeper, closer to this center. When Russia first started to be involved in the Syrian questions, it was just about saying no in the Security Council. Now it got some planes inside. So you see the involvement just increased all the time. And that's the second characteristic of this issue. But first of all, if you want to understand why some Syrian goes on the street, I think we have first to consider what was the Assad regime. So let me frame very quickly what was this regime from almost 40 years. The father of Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad, took the power in 1971 through a coup. He might be called a survivor because Syria has witnessed almost 40 coups between 49 up to 71. So just imagine, you've got like one coup every year or 2 coups per year. Hafez al-Assad took part in almost 15 of them. Each time you've got a team in power who collapse, a new team arriving. It just understand one thing in order to bring back the stability in the country. If you want to create stability in such a country, you need first to put in competition the different mukhabarat, which is intelligence services, to have a clear idea of how it's working on. In Syria, you don't have one political police. You've got 6. Each of these political police gets all the rights, which means that they can arrest anybody, torture him, ask him anything, taking some goods from him, anything else. The first things happening when you're going into jail in Syria, when you are liberated, is that the second political police arrest you. And the first question they ask you is, what was the purpose of the first one to arrest you? Just to be sure not to forget any issues that are going on. So any citizens know that more or less they were under control of these 6 different branches of the political police. For groups of 250 people, we might have one who are connected to one of these services, which is, I think, the higher rate in the world about China, mostly. The competitions create stability because all of them recognize Hafez al-Assad as the great commander. So any kinds of last decisions was taken by the president. Therefore, you've got like a very specific organization in which you've got this supreme president, which was called the eternal president, who gets those 6 political police, who gets all the rights and controlling everything around the countries, and they receive order on a daily basis. You have to arrest somebody, you have to take care for these communities, you have to careful for these goods, and so on. But how can you find financial support for these systems? It was created on what I call predatory activities. A predatory activity is very simple. Contrary to the exchange, monetary exchange or gift and counter-gift, in predatory activity, you just take. For example, you create a checkpoint. On the checkpoint, you put a soldier. The soldier can ask you any kinds of money because you want to cross. Therefore, you don't need to pay him a salary because you get some money. And you don't need to find some kinds of tariff and incomes to support your own systems. And that was working because Syria invaded at the time Lebanon. And from your positions in the hierarchy, you get a position in the predatory activities. If you were a general, you might control drug traffic and drug dealings from Lebanon to Syria to Europe. If you were a general, you can control car stolen activities from Europe to the Middle East. If you were just a soldier, you can just get some little funds from any citizens. At the time, Lebanon was under civil war, so Syrians were one of the militias around the countries. Everything was working well, as you've got a possibility to move your people outside of the country, getting back to the country, and controlling pretty well the situations. Apart from the fact that any 5 to 6 years, you've got an uprising. Of course, when you see the people under control, to a certain extent, each generation witness an upheaval. At the very late 70s, you've got the first large demonstrations from the urban citizens in Syria requesting for the end of the rules of emergency and the comeback of the freedoms, political basic freedoms such as political parties, press, and so on. It's increased from 76 up to 80. Then it turned to be a military fight between the mukhabarat, those intelligence services, and the oppositions. And finally, Hafez al-Assad find a way to crush the protest in the cities of Hama, which is the 4th most important city in Syria, the equivalent, maybe, let's say, of Washington or something like this. And it's almost destroyed its center. There was at least 25,000 people who were dead in 3 weeks. Then the kingdom of fear started in Syria. You know that any kinds of activities was against the regime might lead you not to the death, but to disappear, which is a bit different. Because when you disappeared, nobody knows exactly what's happening on. Anybody wants to know what are behind the secrets, and so on. That was the situations in Syria. And the last point, how it's working on, is like to turn the fight from external actors who were plotting against some internal actors that was before the arriving of Hafez al-Assad to a struggle for the Middle East. The struggle for the Middle East, it's an expression from British journalist Patrick Seals, who explained that Hafez al-Assad find a way to export all the struggles in the different countries on the neighborhood. He find a way to shelter all kinds of terrorist groups or all kinds of activists against the other governments. So any kinds of governments who want to fight against him, he might use them against those governments. For example, you've got an office of Hamas, of Hezbollah, you've got offices of opponent to Saddam Hussein, you've got offices, again, of Kurdish workers' parties, and so on. So anytime, for example, the Turkish authorities say anything against the regime, he might find a way to send some troops towards southern parts of Turkey and to create some kinds of troubles. That was going on also against, Western power. There was many hostages who were in Syria, and for example, one of the French researchers called Michel Serra was arrested in Lebanon in 1985, and he was returned to France dead in 2005, thanks to the Syrians who just give back his body. So it was a very clear threat. But as any eternal president, one day Hafez al-Assad died because he was a bit too old at 70, and he gave the power to his sons through the first successful inheritance from a father to his son in a republic. This new president was called at the time the new president with blue eyes. He was educated in London, so anybody was thinking that, okay, he's a modern guy, we can talk with him. The only problem is that Bashar al-Assad, son of Hafez al-Assad, just changed a few of the rules. The first rule was not to create a democracy or to give back some freedom to the people after just a couple of months in which we can imagine that he will do it. But he concentrates more and more the power in his own hand. Why? Because his father was ruling through some kinds of collegiums of headquarter of big master of this mukhabarat. The difference with the son is that he can't trust any people who are ruling those mukhabarat, so he just changes them all the time, which create a kind of dichotomy or schizophrenic systems. You've got the head who know everything around the country, controlling everything, but he did not get access to the ground as his father got, because he has to follow all kinds of the different information coming every day. The second transformation, second change came from the geopolitical situations of Syria in those days. Maybe you know where is Syria, but I just brought by some few maps because I think it's important. When Bashar al-Assad took the power, it was 2000s. 3 years later, during the first 3 years, he started to make some connections between Iraq under American embargo and some of these mukhabarat systems, just to bring some goods. So it creates some kinds of illegal or informal market between Syria and Iraq. For example, you've got one city here called Homs, which became quite important. Oops, here. Who was connected from here to the regions in Iraq called Al-Anbar. And they mostly exchanged some goods and they might provide some productions, alimentary productions, and so on. This changed very quickly in 2003 after the American invasions because it just collapsed all kinds of exchange. And for Bashar al-Assad, at this time, it was very clear that Syria will be the next country will be invaded by the Americans. So he started to organize some kinds of resistance, as they call locally, which is more or less organizing some networks of jihadi people who might go from Syria to Iraq to fight against the Americans. The idea of Bashar is that Americans should not have any more peace in Iraq, because if they have some peace, they will turn to Syria. The second earthquake arriving was from Lebanon. An uprising started in 2005, which put an end to the systems of the predatory activities I mentioned earlier. In 2005, in a very short period, 2 or 3 months, the external power, mostly French and Americans, pushed pressure on Syria to say that they have to escape from Lebanon and to put all their military outside in a few months. Due to the pressure, Bashar al-Assad decided to withdraw his troops from Lebanon. Therefore, the predatory activities started to go around the countries. But, it's those problems with those regimes, it's like a genetic code. You can't change a genetic code very easily. So, as a need to practice predatory over activities, it just turned from Lebanon to Syria. And for example, if we are taking this area, because it started to be important in 2 years after, the southern part of Syria. Southern part of Syria is quite famous for its agricultural activities. All the foods are produced mostly from here to here, but mostly in this area. It's the perfect area. It's like here, Middle West America. And part of the activities were turned here as one of the great guys from the regime called Rami Makhlouf, cousins of Bashar al-Assad, and it started to monopolize all the economic activities. In this region, more particularly, it started to buy the agricultural lands, which is very easy when you are in those kinds of free market, because nobody can say no to Rami Makhlouf. If you say no to Rami Makhlouf, you will have some problems with the mukhabarat. So you started to sell those lands. At that time, you were in a period of drought and a lot of decrease of the foods. So you've got like the great symbols. You lost your activities, and Syria don't get enough foods at the same time. Why it takes those lands to turn them in some kinds of tourist activities. So it's like creating some kind of shock, economic shock. But this is still going on until 2010. In 2010, for the first year since long term, any kinds of reports said nothing was going on in Syria. It was very strange. Everybody was saying we've got some drought, we've got a massive economic crisis, and there is no protest. But everybody just started to speak in their own family. Of course, you can't speak on the street, you can speak outside, and so on. Tunisian uprising started in 2010, December 2010, then the Egyptian uprising. Just to put things clearly, the first time I spoke about Egyptian events was when I take a taxi from Damascus to Amman when we cross the border. Nobody will speak before the border of any kinds of foreign events. That was not possible. You just believe if you started to speak with a foreigner about those events that you will go strictly to jail. Unfortunately for the regime, some kids don't get in their mind what kinds of threat they might face in case of going against the regime. So in March 2011, some 15 kids of these towns in Oran, Deraa, started to put some graffiti in their high school saying, Bashar al-Assad, you will be the next after Tunisia and Egypt. Naturally, they disappeared. The first sequence started like this. Their family were quite great family, connected to notables. Part of them came from tribes who were quite famous in their area, started to make some discussions with the governor. The governor just said, I don't heard about your kids for the first meetings. On the second meetings, he said, just forget your kids. If you don't know how to do kids anymore, you can send us your wife. When you are in traditional society, that's not a very good thing to say. The third meeting was not with the governor, but was some representative of Bashar al-Assad. And finally, they received tens of these 15 kids without their teeth and their nails. People started to be hungry. And they just request on the first Friday justice. They don't want, as they said, Isqatanism, the downfall of the regime. They just say, we want the people who do that to our kids. Because you can punch our kids, that's okay, but you don't go to such a kinds of torture. And the uprising started from the grounds very easily. Day after day, you're going to the mosque and you protest from the mosque every Friday. Why are you going in Syria in the mosque to make some demonstrations? That's very easy. If you want to organize any meetings in Syria, you need a mukhabarat if you are more than 5 people. So here we need at least 4 or 5 mukhabarat just to be sure that any discussion is okay. In the mosque, you can gather. And gathering is the first thing very hard to do. Because if you don't gather, you can't go in demonstration. Because people will crush you directly. And it started every Friday by you're going in the mosque, you're going outside, shouting, we want justice, we want some change, and the regime shoot you. First with gas tears, then with some snipers, and so on. And it spread very quickly by solidarity. It spread through the families. You know, from one of your cousins, you call him, there's something happening in Dera? Yes, it's happening this and that. So next month, next week, you're started in your own mosque, in Homs, and etc. And it goes very quickly because in about 3 or 2 months, all these different areas were connected through the revolutions. All of them were going through the same processes, going to demonstrate, to ask for change. I will just mention one of these big demonstrations just to make clear how it was going on. On April 18, April 2011, people in Homs, these big towns you heard about maybe, which is the third town in Syria, gathered in the main square. They've got the image of Egypt. Oh, we need a Tahrir square. We need to do like the Egyptians. We will take the main square, and then all around the world, they will look at the Syrian, and they will say, okay, we have to support the Syrian, Bashar has to go on, and blah, blah, blah. On this day, 20,000 of people gathered in the place. At midnight, the notables of the neighborhoods came and started to say to the young people, mostly 20, 25 years old, you have to leave, because if you are not leaving, there will be some repressions. 30 minutes later, the mukhabarat, the head of the the political police, arrived and said, in 1 hour, we'll start the repressions. 1 hour later, they put some machine guns. They started to put 5 machine guns next to the square, and they opened fire. After 10 minutes, everybody was escaping. There were about 150 dead. At 5 a.m., you've got the trucks who collect the bodies. 6 a.m., you clean the square. At 7 a.m., you can claim there was nobody. There was nothing. That's exactly what is the Syrian black hole. Nothing is happening. You believe that there's something? No, it's a plot. It's a foreign plot. Look at that. There are, it's on the border. So it's the Jordans who want to make some troubles. That was the official rhetoric. But on the ground, some people try to fight. So what's happening then? You can't gather on the main square. So you can shelter yourself in your neighborhood. And neighborhood started to be the place where you can organize all the activities, but you turn them into bunker. Everybody's know one to another. You know, it's close families. So you know people in your flats, you know people around, and you know that any kinds of activities against the regime will mean that all the neighborhood will be concerned by repressions. So you are going on or off. You don't have the choice. The first answer of the regime was to decide to call back young people to the army. There is one function when you do that. First, you control all the young guys because they are in the barrack, so they won't go to the demonstrations. And second, you can put them in the repressive processes. So they will be part of the repression. So they will have to decide between killing people or be killed by their officer. But very quickly, some of them started to escape and to organize some military groups just to say that we refuse to participate to the Syrian repressions, but we don't know what to do. That's why we've got a militarization started from the bottom, and then it turned to the officer. This image is quite famous. It's in the summer 2011. You've got Colonel Assad, which is not Assad, a bit different. There's one later different. But it's famous because it's the first time you've got groups of Syrian officers who start a new ritual. You put your cards, I am Fulan, and I escaped from Syria and I started the Free Syrian Army against the regime. The problem of the militarization was to decide, do we have to defend the people or do we have to attack the regime? Up to now, there is no clear answer. Both strategies are used. Sometimes, like in Homs, at very late of the first year, you've got some defense groups around the demonstration because they just want to protect the demonstrator from snipers and so on. So just kill the sniper and then people can go on the street. Other, like in Damascus and in Deir ez-Zor, started to attack the different points of the regime, the different center of the Mukhabarat, officially to try to catch some people who were arrested, but other way to show that the balance of forces is reversing. But this turned the situations in 2012 in some kinds of war. For the 30th anniversary of the Hama events, if you remember, I told you that his father, Hafez al-Assad, decided to destroy the city of Hama on February 1982. 30 years later, his son, like a family memory, do the same thing for the city of Homs here. It started first by Homs, shelling the neighborhoods, about 300 dead people in the 2 first days. And you've got like testimony, I've got a couple of friends there, just saying, yeah, we've got some bloods everywhere. We were in some bodies for about 3-4 days, and then we just have to escape. Then it turned to the Horan and to Deir ez-Zor, finally to these areas. Which means that you've got some tanks in any kinds of rebel neighborhoods. So if you've got to go on demonstration, you have to face the tanks. So you have to decide first if you want to go to march or not. Just to take an example, that was the Battle of Damascus, when they started or they tried to get the control inside Damascus. If you want to understand why the battles of Damascus was kind of hard, is that you've got all kinds of forces. All the military groups of the regime were inside the capital because they know that if they lost Damascus, they will lose the symbol of the sovereignty. So therefore, you can say the opposition is the true ruler of the country. So you can give them the power. That's my private photos. And you can see how it's working on. Here, you've got the neighborhood where you've got some shellings starting around. First time you see helicopters going around, and then you've got airplanes just to say to the suburbs that you have to stop to fight. As you've got like some protest in the cities, the regime decided to stop all kinds of public services, such as garbage. And finally, the first fight of the opposition was to get visibility. And you've got those graffiti saying, Free Syrian Army was here, and we are in the old town of Damascus. That was the first Friday of the battles. Unfortunately or fortunately, the opposition can't create a break and the regime can't settle the situation, so things going on further. But at the end of 2012, what's happening was the regime was very weakened on its basis. He can't control anymore the territories. He lost at least 70% of the national territory. He then turned to call for his allies to help him more. Naturally, when you are turning the events in a military situations, you need weapons. And both sides will need weapons. If you want weapons, you need to go on the market or to get some allies. First, the opponents try to find some connections towards the friends of Syria, as they call them. And the friends of Syria, mostly Western countries, just answer them, yes, but we are not sure if you are in favor of democracy. We are not sure about your future institutions, and so on. Therefore, they don't give so much to the oppositions. On the contrary, at the beginning of 2013, there were clear involvements of the friends of the regimes, which are three most important powers. First is Iran. Iran gives some funds. For example, they give $100 million to pay some weapons to Russia. Russia at that time just sells some weapons, and the last groups formed by some militias, mostly Hezbollah. You've got his director here, Nasrallah. And they started to send some peoples on the Syrian sides. That was the very beginning of the internalizations. Why Hezbollah forces were important? Hezbollah got a great experiment with the guerrilla. He has foughten Israel for at least 15 years. He defeats Israel several times in southern part of Lebanon, so he knows how to fight inside the cities. Hezbollah is a militia, which is military groups which did not belong to any states. It's united through kinds of sectarian bonds. They are Shia. But mostly they represent what we call the resistance against Israel in southern part of Lebanon. And you can see there's two flags. Here you've got the Lebanese flag because it is one of the representatives of Lebanon, and his own flag saying Hezbollah, which is a party of gods. And you see the Kalashnikov here spraying around. And that's a joke spreading from the opposition saying, oh, look, we find some Israeli villages, because you can't fight Syrian because they're Syrians. You always fight against some kinds of resistance. So we find some Israeli villages around Homs. Israel is here, by the way. So we need to intervene here because we will fight imperialist invasions and so on. This internalization led to the increase of the violence in Syria. Mostly, we get two different sides at the time. On one side, you've got groups of military groups who claim to be representative of the regime. They say that Bashar al-Assad is part of the solutions and they will fight against until death to preserve the regime. On the contrary, you've got groups of oppositions who were divided on local bonds, local neighborhoods and so on, who said, we want the end of the regime because this regime is not part of the solutions. The difference between the two at that time was the twin processes. The regime might control the main axis of communications, as it got some military forces, and he got a great support from other groups. And he also used different tools. He turned from helicopters to airplanes and then started to use, for the very first time, the barrel of TNT barrel. Does everybody imagine what is oil barrel? You see those things in iron you can see sometimes in oil stations. like this, like this. You put off the oils, you put TNT inside, you're taking in an helicopter, you throw over the people. That's very useful. You destroyed about 3-4 blocks. For the US it's 1 block. For Europe it will be 3-4 blocks of houses. So it's very useful against any kinds of demonstrations, any kinds of gathering of groups, etc. And it started to use these techniques from the beginning of 2013. But at that time, it was just 1 or 2, let's say, per month against one neighborhood. On the contrary, the friends of Syria started to request more help from their friends. Americans say they can't help people that we are not sure that they might provide the democracy and so on. So those groups started to ask for Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which helped them more. But they never get full freedom to deliver the true weapon they will need to win. The turning point in this first internalization came in August 2013 when chemical attacks happened in suburbs of Damascus. That was not the first time of these chemicals attacks. I mean, the first time we've heard about was in 2012, so a year earlier. But very quickly after the chemical attacks, Syrians understand that they will have no help from outside anymore. And then you have to decide yourself to fight or to dead or to be die or to escape to other countries. So they started to migrate. The flow of refugees on the neighborhood countries started to be millions. 2 new actors entered the fields for particular reasons. As the regime lost the control over the territory, it decided that some part of the territory will not be any more useful. Those territories were the eastern part of the Syria, mostly this part, from here to here. When I say they withdraw from here, he take all his guys, men, and said, just leave this part. So you don't control anymore the border, nor the border with Iraq, nor the borders with Turkey. So anybody is knowing anything about geopolitics in Syria know that if you don't control your borders, then people from Iraq might enter. And those people of Iraq at the time in these regions of Anbar were mostly some Sunni jihadist groups, and one of them at the time was called Islamic State of Iraq. So in 2012 it started to enter slowly with some few men in Syria. In 2013, as they were like a motorway for them, they just enter more and more. The difference between ISIS, because this turned to be ISIS at the time, and other jihadi groups, they got great experiment. They were fighting for at least 10 years before the Syrian revolutions. And through the Syrian revolutions, they get some things that they will never get in Iraq. It's a universal value to defend. When they will claim to the Muslim people, why are you fighting? They will say, look at that. Bashar al-Assad is destroying his people. He used barrels, he used Scuds, which is ballistic missiles, he used airplanes. Nobody say anything. So we are on the good side. And that was very useful for his own propaganda towards some Muslim societies, such as the French society, Tunisian society, and so on. And on the margins, or on the fringe of the society, some of the kids who don't know really well Islam and so on started to be convinced that if they want to make humanitarian activities, they might join these groups. The fourth groups who entered the fields were the Kurdish groups, which is represented in yellow. And the difference between the revolution and the Kurdish was to say, we want first to establish a Kurdish lands, and then we will see. Kurds, it's like one of the ethnic components of Syrians. There is several different groups in the Kurdish society. One of these groups is called, in Turkey, the Workers' Party, which is a Stalinist party. They've got one chief. It's a vanguard. He is using weapons to defend his own claims. And of course, you've got the freedom, like in any Stalinist party, you have to follow the order of the chief. And this group first started to occupy the Kurdish areas to destroy all other Kurdish forces, which might represent an alternative, and then claiming to say, we are the true revolutions, we will make a Kurdish revolution inside the Syrian revolutions. And they started to occupy those areas where Kurdish people are the great majority, which is here. Kobane, you may hear about it, and Afrin. And their ideas was, what they say mostly to the Americans, is that if you provide us some weapons, we might occupy all the borders between Turkey and Syria, so you will cut this gray zone, which is ISIS zone, from Turkey. So there will not be any more possible for foreign fighters to enter from Turkey. And up to now, that's a new strategy. Of course, as any Stalinist forces, they might not find any agreement with other forces. So for example, when they enter Tel Abyad, they just say to the people, they make ethnic cleaning. But let's go back on how the strategy changed for those fourth actors. If you want to understand nowadays how Syria is going on, the only institution which still exists in Syria is the checkpoint. Any kinds of groups who want to control territories need some checkpoints, which means like any neighborhood, you put like a barrier, you put 2 soldiers on them, a flag, and you say, that's my territories. There is no other control. Those checkpoints works very in an autonomous way. They can fight for themselves, they fight in favor of the group they represent, and they can collect the goods they need to survive. And we can see first the regime doing that, and then the other groups starting to do the same things. The second strategy that was put forward by the regime is if you want to destroy any kind of opposition inside a neighborhood, arresting the people is not enough, because you never know if somebody is not here or out. You need to enter the neighborhood, you will lose your guys, and so on. So the best things to do is to create a blockade and then to wait. And that's the part I call demodernizations of this fight. Since the beginning of 2014, the change in the conflict was you don't increase the level of the quality of the weapons you are using. If I remember you, at the beginning you started with fire guns, then you turned to tanks, then you turned to helicopters, airplanes, ballistic missiles. And then you reverse. First you started those blockades, which creates this kind of situations. Nowadays you've got 5 million of Syrians under blockade, which means that at least this image is quite common. 5 million over 17 million inhabitants. So if you started to free this area, all those people will just flew away from Syria. Why? Because they don't have any more hope in this country. They just want to survive. The second strategy was to employ those TNT barrels I spoke about just before. If I take the example of one famous neighborhood nowadays, Deraya. Deraya, it's a suburbs of Damascus. There were, before the revolutions, about 50,000 inhabitants in it. So you can imagine like a small cities, a very small cities in the US. Per day, you can count about 90 barrels on it. So it's like one every 30 minutes or something like this. It's just break your nerves, just because you just listen to the bombing all your days. On the other side, you've got exactly the same demodernizations of the fight, which represents ISIS. When you look at ISIS, it's like using the violence on propaganda targets. You use a very high level of qualitative violence. You burn the people, you put them in some river, which is very impressive. You are not using massive violence. because they don't have the manpower to do that. But you can impress the other. And what is very striking nowadays is that you've got this kind of exchange between levels of violence, which definitely increase all the times. And the foreign partners of the different groups did not really committed themselves toward the solutions because they never really listened to all the people. They just get other agenda. American, French, and others get definitely some other agenda than solving the Syrian issues. That's why slowly a new kinds of enemy appear, and you've got this international coalition, again, one of the partner of the Syrian crisis. The very, very, very conclusion will be about what's going on right now. Here, you've got a little corridor, which is a corridor of Azaz. If you take control of this corridor, you can provide supplies, humanitarian supplies. I mean, United Nations agency goes through this corridor to spread foods, goods, and foreign partner military equipment in all this area. Russians started to bomb heavily this area to create a break. Nowadays, what I say the people I interviewed last week is that, okay, if we don't receive any more supplies from Turkey, what choice will we get? We can go on the regime side, on ISIS side. If we are going on the regime side, we will be arrested. So, what do you want us to do? Because nowadays, ISIS got some borders connected to this green area here. And the question is to understand if our internalizations of the Syrian issues and the creations of these black holes will turn to a great nightmare, which hasn't started yet, or if we want to start it a true part of understanding the Syrian event in order maybe to settle a bit this crisis.
Well, Matthieu, thanks a lot for this presentation. The Syrian conflict right now is an extremely complex issue, and I hope that we all got a little bit of a better grasp of the situation today. Okay, so I think we're going to open the floor for questions. I'm sure there are many. Thank you. Yes? Okay.
Sorry.
Can you please state your name?
Yes.
And tell us which year you are, and you know.
My name is Katie, and I'm a sophomore and a politics major. And I was just wondering which group you think poses the greatest risk to civilian lives, ISIS or Assad's regime?
It's very easy to answer. I mean, for the moment, it's Assad regime, because he got airplanes. I mean, he can bomb any kinds of towns and is bombing any kinds of towns. But he received great support nowadays from Vladimir Putin, who just, fulfilled the job. If you are thinking about Aleppo, for example, it was just like for my friends who were there, it was just a nightmare when the Russians started, because it increased the bombing 10 times than the Assad regime. What is the problem with ISIS? I think the problem with ISIS is like, it's more the product of our own mistakes. It's not like a real creation. I mean, it hasn't any future if you started to enter in a political solution for this area. But both in Iraq and Syria, you've got exactly the same equation. The regime has turned into a very simple formula. I want to survive the next day, not in future. And I think one of our great mistakes when we are dealing with the regime is to think in terms of, but if he's doing that, is a mistake for his own future, which means in future years. It's a rationality of the daily life, of the immediate time. I want to be there next day. Nouri al-Maliki did exactly the same in Iraq, and it was the first to create this formula. He started to be shaken by his own Shia based in Iraq, because Shia people were in favor of Nouri al-Maliki, which was prime minister of Iraq until 2014. They started to struggle against him. Why? Because they can't have any public facilities, which is electricity, garbage, very basic things. How you can curb social mobilizations? Create a great enemy. He just withdrew his guys from Anbar area. He just cut all kinds of fundings towards all kinds of Sunni tribal groups and tribal chiefs. Those chiefs just flew away. Therefore, you don't have any people on this western part of Iraq, eastern part of Syria. And then you've got ISIS who emerged. When ISIS started to emerge, it did nothing. When it entered to Fallujah, it just called the words and said, "Oh, look at that, there's a great terrorist army just next to Baghdad, we need to do something." And that's just perfect. For the word, you said, "I'm the great fighter against terrorists." For his own population, you say, "You have to negotiate with them now, or to keep me." And so you've got a coalition behind him for 2 years, until the point that they lost Mosul without any fight, and that everybody understands that you can't support a corrupted system anymore if you want to get future. But that was really fantastic in 2014, because you've got these coalitions, Americans next to Iranians fighting together with this Maliki in the middle, which was quite funny for everybody else. And in Syria, the same thing. I will withdraw from a part. I don't fight against ISIS. Some of my guys on the ground might deal on practical issues with them. And then I will say, what do you prefer, ISIS or Assad? Because the first thing ISIS have done in all the part of Syria is to destroy the revolutionary activities and to target all revolutionary activists. And the difference between the regime and ISIS is that ISIS came in after the regime. So they know the name. And they can arrest the good guys. That's why I said Assad is a bit different from ISIS.
My name is Anais Gomez, and I'm a sophomore. My question to you is regarding something that a lot of people have been saying in the media and academics as well, that the only way to stabilize Syria is by stabilizing the regime of Assad again, and then letting the democratic process go on from that, whatever that would mean. My question to you is, what is your opinion on this? I don't agree with it, but I just wanted to see what you felt on it, as if that's the true way to stabilize Syria.
I think we've got the answer from the history. If we want to fight against communism in 1945, we must stabilize Hitler regime. And I'm pretty sure communists won't spread around. That's exactly the same things. How you can imagine that the Syrian will be stabilized? If you want to stabilize Assad regime, you have to take into consideration 3 things. First, there will be at least 12 million of inhabitants who have to go away from Syria. 12 millions, not 3, 12. Nowadays, there are 7 millions who are on the road inside Syria, and they will flee because they have no future. The second point, if you started to stabilize this kind of regime, you will create a kingdom of fear inside Syria and on the neighborhood. So you will create exactly the same systems we know or we witness inward in Central Africa, Great Lakes area, which means that, okay, you stabilize Rwanda under Hutu power because Hutu are democratic and what else. You support them with some weapons. That's very famous for the French. And then 30 years later, they will come back. Of course, people will come back. It will be not Rwanda learned us that when people came back through the war, you might face a genocide. And this genocide solutions is still ongoing in Syria. It's not a genocide, but you can face one of them. And the third problem is that the regime nowadays is such a weakened force that you need to provide him everything. When I said a weakened force, I've got 2 friends in jail. They have been tortured for 2 months, okay? Heavily. Since a year, they are just in jail. And now the Mukhabarat started to say, do you want to be liberated? Just go on the army. So when you imagine that a regime don't get any troops and needs his best opponent to go fighting for him, how can you imagine to stabilize him? Okay, just send all the Russians, Americans, French soldiers on the ground and maybe you can stabilize it. But maybe you will face a great, great struggle from the other side. That's why, in my opinions, I'm not sure we can really stabilize it. On the other point, many Syrians told us since 2011, 2012, we're ready to fight against any kinds of extremism. And once ISIS entered, said, we're ready to fight against ISIS, if you like. But we can't fight if we got a machine gun in our back. And for the moment, when Halep demonstrate and push out, inhabitants of Halep demonstrate and push out ISIS by pacific demonstrations, nobody helped them. Some people in the cities of Jarablus here, under ISIS control, started to demonstrate September 2014. Why? Because they see Americans and French airplanes, and they say, okay, we can demonstrate, they will liberate us. No, they were fighting for Kobane, not for Jarablus. Then you've got a repression from ISIS in Jarablus. About 100 of people were arrested, put it under torture. They learned very well the lesson, they just turned to Turkey and said, okay, we're ready to create some alliance, but we've got some little problem with trust nowadays.
It's a very important and interesting point to understand that when the point you're making about this state being an extremely weak state and at the same time being an extremely violent state. And I think that it's something that we need to remember.
I mean, it's quite common in history when you've got a very weak state, it's always used all kinds of forces. Yeah. If you look at the French Revolution, the terror is the part where the state was very weakened. So what did he do? Just spreading terrorism, as it was called at the times, against the populations. And that's the same situation nowadays in the Assad regime. You know, it's a problem of genetic code. You can't change it.
Hello, my name is Ahmad Saduddin. I'm Syrian. I have been part of, let's say, the political movement that started in 2000, the spring of Damascus. And so I am a historical opponent of the regime. And let's say, fortunately or unfortunately, when the uprising started, I was doing my military service. So I lived many of what, I don't know, Matthieu has explained. I lived them from inside, from a context that was considered, let's say, inside the regime in a certain way. So I have just some, let's say, questions, additions. You mentioned that for the Kurdish, you mean, of course, the PYD when you talk about Kurdish, not the. But I mean, something was missing in the narrative that Kamishli and many Kurdish cities in 2011 played a central role in the demonstrations against the regime. So, and while the PYD was the oppressing part in the Kurdish side. Because this maybe explains why we have this now again, let's say, on the Turkish borders. Second thing, you say that Hezbollah is a militia that doesn't belong to any state. I think it does. It belongs to Iran. I mean, and this has been declared by high-rank Iranian clerks. that Hezbollah is part of the Islamic Republic. And when they said Hezbollah, they didn't mean just Hezbollah in Lebanon. They meant also that now they're the Syrian Hezbollah, and there's an Iraqi Hezbollah. So, I mean, this is maybe also explains why Hezbollah has got involved in Syria. Not because, I guess, Hezbollah has experience in guerrilla, and not because also the Syrian regime didn't have enough soldiers, but because Iran exploited a certain point in the conflict and decided to take control on the land. And this has failed at the end, because we have now Russia. But I mean, at a certain point, it explained also how the conflict evolved to this point. Just a comment about the Syrian army and how, when it was established, I think there wasn't a confusion between to defend or the attack. It was more, I mean, you say that we attack or we defend. I think from 2011 to the middle of 2012, they couldn't even attack. They attacked in certain, like the strategy was more to defend the demonstrations. And if they attacked sometimes, it's because they wanted to defend. Because if they don't attack, they cannot defend. And they were more like hoping that something would happen, or the regime would collapse, or some external power wouldn't allow it again. And unfortunately, at a certain point, maybe in the middle of summer 2012, when I, for example, with many of my colleagues defected altogether, because we understood that there would be no political solution, and the Free Syrian Army started to warn us that if you don't leave, we will target you. And we left altogether. The Syrian army collapsed. The Syrian National Army collapsed at that point. And then it was exactly that date that there was somewhere a decision taken that if we don't attack the regime, this regime will not go away anymore. And it was at a point that people couldn't anymore go back, let's say. Just a question related to the Kurdish, like you said that the Kurdish strategy is to separate the rest of Syria from Turkey so that they wouldn't allow any more, let's say, extremists to enter and join Daesh or ISIS. So
that's what strategy toward Americans.
Yes, I mean, you think this is not been declared. I mean, this is not declared. I mean, so it's analysis. This is my question. It's your analysis, or it's, or do you think it's, because this implies that Turkey is facilitating the entrance of extremists. Because if the Kurdish would control, it means that Turkey is facilitating. Because I think the Turkish state would be more in a better position to control the borders than a Kurdish militia. Thank you.
As you said, one thing is very important. The problem is nowadays when we are speaking about Kurdish forces, we only speak about one group, PYDs. PYDs, it's PKKs. PKKs, it's Worker Party in Turkey. It became PYDs in Syria. It's just other names, but it's exactly the same groups. Öcalan is their chief. As I told you at the very beginning of my speech, the Hafez al-Assad regime, so the father, welcomes all kinds of groups who might create some disturbance on the neighborhoods. So he welcomed PKK. And he welcomed its Syrian representative, which are PYD. And he finds some kinds of solutions toward the Kurdish area, mostly in Hasakhi here. In this part, Hasakhi is here. And saying more or less, because there was a Kurdish uprising in 2004, which was crushed by the Syrian armies, and nobody heard about it. About 200,000 people were dead, but 200 people were dead. It is nothing. And at that time, the regime understands that PYD might be his second-hand control. It's not like a clear commitment toward PYD, but it's like a local agreement. You control your people, and you will receive some kinds of agreement from us. When he left the different localities, there were clear agreement on that point between PYDs and Assad regime forces, which means like they know when to go to the barrack. We leave at this hour, you can go, and you can take weapons and so on. About the strategy between Kurdish, it's from interviews from Kurdish, from PYD's guys. We clearly say, because I mean, we just have to go back on this situation in 2013. In 2013, Americans started to be upset that maybe there's a problem in Iraq. There is Fallujah problems, ISIS started to be well known, and it was a year after the great narrative of the victory of Barack Obama. Barack Obama just said, okay, we settled a democracy in Iraq, it's more or less peaceful, we can withdraw. And then you've got ISIS. So you've got the worst nightmare for America, or for the American presidents. And one of these components who appear very clearly towards Iraq is that you have to forbid any kinds of extensions of ISIS or Islamist groups. In December 2012, they started saying Nusra is a terrorist group, which was the first time they said Nusra is one of the Islamist groups in Syria. And they started that this one is terrorist, the other are not. And you know, in American law, terrorist groups is very specific. If you're a terrorist group, you can't receive any kinds of support, any kinds of helps. You can't, for example, cure their soldiers and so on. So it's very, I mean, it's a heavy tool on their head. And the problem was how to involve Turkey or how to involve some actors in the Syrian solutions. And you've got two answers. Turkish answer, Kurdish answer, at the same time, the same way. Who can control the border? Turkey answer saying, we can control heavily the border, but we want a solution in Syria. And up to now, Erdogan said the same thing. We won't do anything apart from the fact that we have got a clear commitment that there will be a solution in Syria. And the Americans say, no, not exactly. You can make a solution in Kobane, but not on the border. That was in 2014. The Kurds said, we solve one of your problems. You won't have to go against the Syrian sovereignty because we are Syrian. So if you support the Kurdish, you can take the control of the border with some Syrian citizens. So Russian won't say anything because you support Syrian. You don't support the foreign invasions of Syria. And that's why the Kurdish suggest after the Turks to take the control of the border. And Americans just forget them for about a year and a half. And then they started to say during the Kobane battles that maybe it could be part of the solution. And they just started to make a great support for the Kurdish forces of PYD in summer 2015. So at least 6 months ago. And now you've got this kind of coalition, which is kind of new Frankensteins, which is Kurdish forces who have to liberate Arab area in order to establish some kinds of, which is like what I call a Frankenstein forces, because we just saw the first impact on the grounds a week, 10 days ago. They just took 2 positions, southern part of Assad, about 20,000 inhabitants, Arab, flew away in ISIS areas. Because they said, for us, it's better to live under ISIS control than under Kurdish controls. In this matter, I think that may be not part of the solutions, but I'm not sure. Maybe there is.
Hi, my name is David. I'm in my 3rd year. I was wondering, in your opinion, given the instability in the region, if a Kurdish state or calls for a Kurdish state are feasible or warranted?
That's always the same questions. If there's any problems about stabilities and integration, why not create a state? So, if I'm considering there is a black issues in the United States, why don't we create a black state in the US? I'm not sure that's a solution. I mean, creating a state is not, first, it's a great technology. First thing you have to do is to put some borders, and that's a nightmare. Because who belongs to who? I mean, the first Kurdish communities is Damascus. So Damascus is in the States or how it's the state? Are you pushing out those communities from Damascus? Then Aleppo is the same thing. That's why the great deal with Syria. Okay, there's instability, we will make some states. We'll divide Syria between Alawite, Druze, and so on. And I'm always fascinating because I always heard that, mostly in the US when I go for conferences and so on, this is the Joshua Landy solutions, let's share Syria in different territories and that will create stabilities. And you say, but you came from a society which is like a great melting pot. And you say like you have to make some borders and to create some states and to separate the people. Why? I mean, why not going on a real political solutions, which mean a strong commitment toward political integrations of the people, rather than saying, who are you? Okay, you're Kurds, go there. Because that's the solutions we saw in Iraq. If I ask somebody, are you Shiite? Are you Sunni? Are you Kurdish? If you are not at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, you will become somebody. And it will be exactly the same if I do the same jobs in the US, in Latin America, and so on. You will be Christians or Indians or what else. I mean, identity, you can create them. If there's some power, link it to your identity, you will be a true guys from Paris or from Christians or what else against the other. And then you will have to fight for your borders.
Hi, I'm Grace. I'm a journalism major. I was just wondering if you could briefly talk about your experience on the ground as like a foreigner and a researcher.
I get the great opportunity to get a residency card saying that I was professor, mudaris in Arabic. So basically I can move around everywhere, more or less easily. Take times, tea, discussions. And you can cross the checkpoints and, you can go from one side to another side and so on. So I mostly traveled in Syria until October 2012, almost everywhere. It was quite hard sometimes. I was very lucky sometimes. I discovered the barrel TNT in November 2012 when it exploded about 500 meters from me. So that was nice. But it was a perfect place to write a PhD because you come back to your PhD, you just wrote your PhD saying, okay, going back to the past, don't want to know the word, I can concentrate.
And your last trip, can you tell us a little bit about your last trip to the region?
I was just in Lebanon just to see how things was going on. That's a good time to go to Lebanon, actually, because Lebanese forces don't know how to settle their problems, so they don't care about any other problems. So I move around the countries from Beirut and to Bekaa Valley, make some couple of interviews. I saw mostly people arriving from 2014, 2015, so I can collect new testimony. Because my idea is, if you want to understand Syria, which is quite a nightmare, is that you need to know somebody from any neighborhood, any village. Because the reality is not framed through sectarian bonds. It's first framed through, are you inhabitant from Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, this village in the Horan, and so on, because your daily life was framed through this from 2012. Then you've got connections through the communities. So I was quite happy because in Bekaa Valley I can meet some guys who can explain me more about Karamun region, which is the border here, about how the blockades are organized and how they can imagine the solutions for nowadays. And what was very striking is that first, the second generation of the revolutionary movement, because the first generation had just already left. The second generation is ready to leave because there is no future. And the question is about, is there the third generation or not? Second point is that everybody started to understand that the international agenda is more or less creating a two-path solutions, ISIS or Assad. So you have to decide for yourself, are you going to exile, or are you going to Assad, or are you going to ISIS? What the problem is that as if we're considering the waves of arresting the people, there is at least, let's say, 1 million and a half of inhabitants, over 20 million of inhabitants who have been arrested and tortured. So at least there is one member of every family who have been tortured to death. On that point, I'm not sure they will go straight towards Assad. And most of the Syrians said, as usual, okay, guys, you want to fight against ISIS, we're ready to do it. Why are you just considering one of the forces and not the guys who are destroying our town, our village, raping our women, and so on? And you pretend to be democratic countries. And that's, very striking. The point is, the Syrian never can imagine that you can reach these situations. You know the red line. There is a red line if there is a red line. Okay, one red line, it's crossed. Second red line, it's crossed. Then now everybody is playing with chemical weapons. And so it was like some kinds of intense moment.
Yeah, and the PhD therapy.
No, I'm finished the PhD. That's the problem.
My name is Joe. I'm a politics major. I'm a sophomore. I guess just to conclude, what do you think that Syria's next step should be to actually stabilize the region in a more permanent manner?
What do you mean by next steps?
So what do you think that foreign actors or the role foreign actors should take in trying to stabilize the region?
They first have to stop to do anything and start to think. That's important, thinking before acting. I quite remember my last trips, my last fieldworks in Washington, D.C. It was April 2014. Any guys from state departments to any think tank, same things. Reports are very clear. The president knows what's going on the ground. But there is no Americans who are killed. Just wait for one American to be killed and you will see. 3 months later, you've got these 2 hostages killing by ISIS, you've got the first bombing. So if you want to bomb, that's a great, very answer. It doesn't create anything on the ground, it's not part of the solution, and it costs a lot. So as the French stop do it, we stop because we don't have any more weapons.
Yeah, we don't have, we're broke.
But that's very symbolic. That's very symbolic of how policy towards Syria is going on. We haven't think about how many weapons we've got before bombing. Okay, you killed the guys in the 19th neighborhoods, Paris, we will strike Syria. What the connections? And Syrians just said, okay guys, why everybody want to play with us? It's like new play, you've got some bombs, so we need to. So first, stop to do that. Second things, think about how you can organize a real Geneva conference between foreign partners and what kinds of agenda you can create, but with very practical things. Because it's not general principle you need. You need to reverse, in a Middle Eastern strategy, you need to reverse the Oslo processes. The Oslo processes between Israel and Palestine was more or less put some general principle first and then practical second. When we see the result, we understand that maybe it's not the good way. So reverse. Practical things, then general principle. Which means that you don't say from one side to another side, we refuse Assad or anything. That's not the solution. But how can you control one side or another? What does it mean? You're friends of the regime, for example, as Russians. Are you going to send your guys and arresting these guys or not? That's the practical solutions. And you need first these international conferences to settle a few points. And then on the local grounds, that's very simple, things are going on the grounds. You need to organize assembly on local basis in which they will reach agreements. There is some. But any times you organize some kinds of agreements, settlements, like what we call hudna, some peace agreements on the grounds, there is one of the factions, mostly from the regime, who destroyed it. Just look at what came in Aleppo. You make an international ceasefire and you say everything is okay. And regime militia just started to shoot. Why? Because you don't control them. The regime don't control anymore its troops. So you've got the two sides. He can control some of them, but not all of them.
All time, long time ago. But the problem is that they don't want to respect it as well.
Yeah, they don't want because they want to survive.
Russia
The problem is, up to now, and in my opinion, but it's just my opinions, the problem of the Western countries when they are dealing with Russia is not putting the price on the table. Okay, you want something from the regime? Okay, just go on. Put pressure on Russia. Because Russia is just a power, as ourselves. But when you say, okay, they say no, so we don't do anything. Okay, guys, that's good. If I just said I occupy this country and you don't say, oh, it's bad, it won't going on. You want to put pressure nowadays against Russia? Give some land-air missile to the oppositions. After 3 planes, you will see Russia coming back to the negotiation tables and say, okay, so, because for the moment, Russians don't lose guys, and they don't lose money.
There is no leverage against them.
I mean, if Americans haven't lost guys and money in Iraq, I think they will still be in Iraq.
Thank you. Thanks a lot again.